This is The Raid, exposing the dark world of America's deportation machine. I'm your host, John Carlos Frey. Eunice Cho is senior counsel at the ACLU National Prison Project. She's a nationally recognized expert and litigator on issues pertaining to immigration detention, including access to counsel, conditions of confinement, and the expansion, privatization, and militarization of the nation's immigration detention infrastructure. She has served as lead and co-counsel in numerous cases to protect the rights of immigrant detainees, including people held at the cruelly named Alligator Alcatraz detention facility and the Guantanamo Naval Base, as well as multiple Freedom of Information Act cases regarding ICE's detention practices and infrastructure. Welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me, John.
Of course. And I know that you know why I want to talk to you, certainly about some of the reporting that the ACLU has been doing. But you had kind of a specific branch, if I can say, or a specific area of expertise within the ACLU that is your National Prison Project. Can you just give me a little information about what that is?
Well, yes. Well, and thank you so much for having me today. The ACLU National Prison Project, our work is really dedicated to ensuring that our nation's prisons, jails, and other places of detention comply with the Constitution, domestic law, and other international human rights principles, and to end the policies that have given the U.S. the highest incarceration rate in the world. And as a subpart of that, we also work on immigration detention, the existence of immigration detention, the treatment of people who are in immigration detention, and now the expansion of immigration detention under the Trump administration. And so my work really focuses on litigating and advocating and organizing with people who are being held in immigration detention facilities around the country, as well as communities that are working to stop the detention of immigrants in their communities.
Can you just give me a little about, you said, what the U.S. Constitution sort of requires for imprisoning people, and we're the largest jailers in the world. We're not just talking about immigrant detention. We're talking about prison system all across, criminals, a crime-related prison as well. I'm sure that's the wrong term. But first of all, what are some of the basic laws that we're not adhering to that you see? And why would the ACLU even focus on this? I'm assuming that we're in violation of some of these tenets.
Right. Well, the Constitution protects the rights of people who are incarcerated. So the rights of prisoners. The Eighth Amendment says that no prisoner shall be subject to cruel and unusual punishment. And by extension, the Supreme Court has found that people who are in detention, so that includes people who are in jail, people who have been put in a carceral setting before that they have been adjudged guilty of any crime. So people who are awaiting trial, for example, as well as people who are in civil detention, like people who are in immigration detention, must also not only be protected from cruel and unusual punishment, they can't actually be subject to punishment at all. And so people who are in these circumstances cannot be subject to punitive treatment when they're being held in detention facilities. And what we do is to make sure, as much as possible, is that people who are held in these facilities are treated with safety and dignity to the maximum extent possible, and that the government isn't depriving people of rights when they are in these detention facilities.
And specifically, though, does that have certain protocols federally? Are you supposed to feed people, make sure that they have medical attention, a place to sleep, having clean conditions, not overcrowding? I mean, are there specific protocols that would make it look like the prison system is adhering to constitutional rights?
Well, what is constitutional and what the standards are don't always line up. But as you kind of mentioned, people who are in immigration detention, for example, must have all of those things that you've underscored, right? People must be provided with adequate medical and mental health care when they're being held in government custody, because they can't go to a doctor otherwise. They must be provided with safe, clean drinking water, food, a place to sleep, adequate heating or cooling, hygiene, clothing, but Also, access to counsel, the ability to speak with their families. These are all things that courts have found are protected by the Constitution when you are held in government custody, including immigration detention facilities.
And if there's a violation of such rights, the ACLU would step in and file some kind of a brief or possibly a lawsuit. Is that how we try to keep the system in check?
Well, we certainly file many lawsuits around the country on behalf of people who are in immigration detention, jails, and prisons. There are so many people that the ACLU obviously cannot sue on behalf of everybody. But what we try to do is bring cases that are as strategic as possible to help as many people and to push the law forward in order to protect these constitutional rights for everybody.
And now that we're sort of maybe starting to talk a little bit about immigration or immigrant detention as opposed to what would be criminal detention or you said jail, I think is the word that you used, right? There's a distinction between an immigrant detention facility and another one that might be civil or criminal. Do I have that right?
Well, all immigration detention is civil. So, people who are here in the United States and may be violating immigration laws, that is not a crime. That is a civil violation. And so people who are being held in immigration detention are supposedly in quote unquote civil detention. But that really is a legal fiction, because when you look at the actual circumstances of where people are being held, they are oftentimes the same facilities as prisons, as people who are actually being held in prisons because they are serving sentences for crimes. That happens quite a bit in the immigration detention system. And so when we look at it and kind of peel away those layers, we know that people who are being held in these immigration detention facilities are being subject to the same types of abuses, the lack of medical care, the use of punitive solitary confinement. In many detention facilities, we're hearing horrific stories of brutal beatings of detainees, people who are being threatened with further abuse if they don't sign, orders voluntarily. If they don't sign voluntary departure orders to self-deport from the United States. This is the kind of coercion that we're seeing in immigration detention facilities nationwide.
So I'm kind of curious because I'm sort of hearing something for the first time, and I've covered this myself in my own reporting. Are we even allowed to treat people who have a civil offense or a possible civil offense criminally? I mean, it sounds like the punishment for being in a civil facility or an immigration detention facility seems as harsh as it would be if I've committed a crime. And is that fair or is that just, I guess, is the question.
Well, that's an excellent question. And that is the argument that we make to the courts all the time, which is that these conditions of confinement are unconstitutionally punitive and that immigrant detainees should not be treated in this manner. So that immigrants who are being placed in detention should be provided with basic protections such as food, water, medical care, mental health care, the very basics that are actually supposed to be provided to people who are imprisoned in the United States. And what we are seeing is many times the conditions in which people are being held are even worse than some prisons, to be honest.
And how do you litigate that? I mean, is it just the civil suits that you bring against the federal government? I don't see the American Red Cross coming in. I don't see big national organizations sort of raising a fuss. The way that immigrants are being treated in these facilities seems to go unnoticed for the most part.
Well, I think we certainly bring lawsuits on behalf of people who are in immigration detention. We also bring lawsuits on behalf of organizations who represent and serve immigrants who are in detention. That is something that we do quite often. And we have represented many nonprofit organizations in that capacity. That is absolutely true. And that is one of our greatest concerns about the expansion of immigration. We are heading into unprecedented times with respect to the expansion of immigration detention nationwide. As you mentioned, the Trump administration has received an inordinate amount of money under the Big Beautiful Bill Act, where they received $45 billion to expand the immigration detention system nationwide. In contrast, last year, ICE received $4 billion. So it's a tenfold increase. And the increase of immigration detention, the Trump administration came in stating that they wanted to detain 100,000 people every day. They are well on their way to doing so. As of this month, there's a record high level of people who are being held in immigration detention facilities, over 70,000 people per day. This is the highest it has ever been. And the plans that we are seeing with respect to the expansion of immigration detention really should scare us all. As you mentioned, the Trump administration has thrown the playbook out the window for, traditional immigration detention. They are now trying to build tent facilities across the United States. We've seen that at places like the Alligator Alcatraz facility, Fort Bliss military base. But as you mentioned, there are now reports that ICE is planning to convert warehouses in communities around the United States and turn them into detention centers, into detention camps where people, are being housed in the same buildings that were meant for storing goods. And that is horrifying because the numbers that we are seeing with respect to how many people may be held at these facilities nationwide will basically overshadow much of the expansion that has happened even this year.
If there are violations to begin with of the way that someone's supposed to be treated when they're in a detention facility, who's the governing body? Where's the oversight? I understand that you, along with colleagues and sympathetic organizations, are trying to bring suit or bring attention, raise awareness, all of that. But where's the oversight here? Why am I allowed to double, triple, quadruple the size of detention facilities when I'm already in violation of the way I'm treating people? It doesn't seem like anybody's governing this.
That's an excellent question, John. And that is one of our chief concerns at this moment. One thing that we have seen is that ICE has gutted all of its oversight of conditions of confinement and immigration detention. Part of the reductions in force that took place earlier this year were to fire almost the entire staff of the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, which it responded to complaints about conditions of confinement and immigration detention in years past. The same with the ICE Immigration Detention Ombudsman's Office. That has also been gutted. And they have also changed many of the inspection standards for detention facilities to weaken them significantly. They've allowed detention facilities to, quote unquote, inspect themselves about their adherence to these detention standards, which one can imagine how well that would go. And I think it is no coincidence that we are now seeing a record number of people who have died in immigration detention under the Trump administration. And I am afraid that that number will just grow larger.
I just want to go back. Is there an oversight committee here with Congress? Shouldn't members of the administration or members of the Department of Homeland Security come before some sort of congressional hearing to ask why the facilities are being run the way that they are or why people are dying? I'm not seeing that.
That's right. And in the past, Congress has played that role to some extent. What we're seeing now is that the majority party in Congress has not been willing to hold the ICE detention facilities accountable in that manner. There are, members of Congress who've actually tried to go and visit detention facilities in their own jurisdictions, in their own districts, to try to enter the detention facilities and see what is going on. And many times they're being turned away at the gate, being told that they cannot enter. The Department of Homeland Security has issued new memos stating that these types of visits cannot happen unless there's up to 7 days advance notice. And members of Congress have had to sue the government to be able to actually enter these detention facilities to fulfill their oversight roles. And so we see how much the Trump administration is truly erecting barriers to even the most basic oversight responsibilities by other branches of the government.
Wait, a member of Congress, a member of the federal government, somebody who has a constituency, maybe even a detention facility within their district, has to sue their own government just to gain entry? Aren't they allowed by law to gain entry?
That's right. And I think that's the argument that the members of Congress would make in their lawsuit. The federal courts have said, yes, of course, members of Congress should be able to visit these detention facilities. But it took a lawsuit in order to be able to do that. And I think that speaks volumes about the particular moment that we're in.
Of course, if I'm a member of Congress and I want to inspect a facility, they're going to have a week to clean it up. Is basically what that's all about, it seems like to me.
That's right. I always laugh to myself when I see the potted flowers and the new paint on the walls when these inspections take place.
So how are you getting information from the inside? How are you finding out what's actually going on if there are no inspections or the inspection process has been gutted? Members of Congress are going to take up to a week to be able to gain access. Are the detainees, the people who are the ones who are crying for help?
Absolutely. And it's people who are in immigration detention facilities who can tell you the best as to what is happening in these facilities, what rights violations are taking place, how they're being treated. And so detainees often are able to speak if they're being provided with the access to telephones and counsel that are supposed to be provided under the Constitution. Detainees can often at least try to send this information and describe what is happening to their loved ones, to their attorneys, to describe how people are being treated. But one additional barrier that we are facing now under the Trump administration is actually the increasing isolation and the lack of transparency that people who are held in detention even have an opportunity. They are not being given the opportunity to even make phone calls to their family members or talk to their lawyers. This is why we sued, for example, the government regarding the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay. If you'll remember, about this time last year, the Trump administration announced that they were going to set up massive immigration detention camps at Guantanamo. And, there was a huge show of people being chained and placed on military planes, being flown to Guantanamo Naval Station in Cuba. But there was no information about who these people were, their names. They could not call their lawyers or their loved ones. And the ACLU filed suit, and we were able to file a lawsuit challenging the fact that the government had placed these people in incommunicado detention. We only knew who they were because family members saw the news clips with Kristi Noem on the military tarmac and multiple people being held in chains. People were able to say, that is my son, that is my brother. And we can't otherwise get any information from the government about who's being held at Guantanamo or what is happening to them. And after we were able to file suit on behalf of the family members, did the government start to give very limited access to detainees to be able to talk to their lawyers and or their family members. But even then, they have told us that people at Guantanamo only have 5 minutes, sometimes each day or per week, to call their family members. If they have said certain things, that the guard next to them will hang up the phone and prohibit them from further talking to them. We have clashed with the government multiple times about whether or not there is actually adequate access to counsel and adequate communication with lawyers. That is still being litigated, but this really gives you a flavor of the type of restrictions and the isolation that the government has been putting people in detention in during this past year. The same is true for people at Alligator Alcatraz. We filed a lawsuit there because when the Alligator Alcatraz detention facility opened, attorneys were trying to talk to their clients who were held at that facility and would drive to the facility, but were met by armed guards at a military checkpoint and told them that they could not enter the facility, that there was no way to communicate with their clients in the detention facility. It was only after we filed suit did there become a very, very rudimentary way for people to be able to talk to their clients.
I'm a little frustrated by everything that I'm hearing, and I've read this, but it sounds different when I'm actually hearing an ACLU attorney telling me this, with a conversation. This is what's going on in my head. Typically, I'm assuming that the federal government, for the most part, tries to uphold the tenets of the Constitution, tries to respect people who've been incarcerated. I know there's always been corruption. There's always been problems. It's not a perfect system. I'll grant that. But it feels like the opposite is happening. It feels like there's a direct desire, if that's the right word, to violate the Constitution, to thumb their nose at what's supposed to be happening, and the laws be damned. We don't really care about protocol and what immigrants are supposed to or not supposed to have while they're being detained. Is that how you see it? It almost feels like a direct violation on purpose.
I think you're tapping into something very important, John, and that is how the government is trying to use inhumane conditions in detention facilities and basic flouting of constitutional protections as a way to send a message of deterrence to people. They're trying to use these horrifying detention conditions as a way to tell people you should self-deport from the United States and don't come here. And that is exactly what Donald Trump and Kristi Noem has said in press releases when they've opened these types of facilities. It is a deterrent effect. And that, of course, in and of itself is unconstitutional. Detention can't be used to deter people from migration in any way. But I think it's also a basic I think it really reflects the way that this administration views people who are immigrants, that they are less than human, that they can be treated in abjectly terrible ways, deprivation of basic needs, and that the Constitution doesn't matter. And we've also seen government attorneys make arguments that are not credible, that are misrepresenting facts. And we've seen courts being increasingly frustrated by the obstruction and by the false claims that the government is making, especially with respect to its treatment of immigrants.
In the way that our government is set up and the way that it works with the different branches of government, I'm assuming that it's members of Congress or the congressional body that would be able to put pressure on the executive branch to do the right thing. But that piece is missing. Is that right?
It seems to be the case. And it seems that Congress has actually written a $45 billion check to ICE to be able to detain people in this manner.
So just not necessarily to play devil's advocate, but I'm going to sort of give a list of what my understanding of how somebody who is in detention should be treated and maybe ask you if any of those things are actually happening in detention. So let's say that I'm in the United States and I have an expired visa and I get arrested or detained by ICE. I get put into a custody facility, a detention facility. I should have a right to make a phone call. I should have a right to seek an attorney or some kind of representation. I should have adequate meals regularly. I should have privacy, some kind of privacy. I should be able to have some kind of time for recreation. I should also know how to be able to contact my family, or my family should know where I am. If it's my wife or my loved ones, they should know what facility I'm in when I'm arrested. There should be a way for me to make that kind of communication. And then I should, if I'm fighting my case, my immigration case, I should have some kind of hearing, or at least have the option to maybe be remanded to a guardian or someone outside. I don't necessarily need to stay in custody if I haven't committed a crime. I could go and fight my case outside of the detention facility, right? I should have that option. So the list of maybe 10 things that I've just mentioned, how many of those are happening?
Well, we are seeing these types of violations where the deprivation of these protections are happening on a day-to-day basis nationwide.
So none of those are being granted, or most of those are not being granted, or for the most part, they're a violation of most of those.
Well, what we can say is that we have heard reports from detention facilities across the country where these types of protections are not being provided on a daily basis. So
it's a violation of human rights, civil rights, constitutional rights, all the above?
All the above, right? What is happening in these facilities doesn't comport with the Constitution. It doesn't comport with human rights. It doesn't comport with detention standards themselves. And what we are seeing is the harm that is taking place. So many people who are being detained often give up their cases because they can't bear the treatment. They are afraid of deteriorating health. They're afraid that they might die in detention. And this is something that I hear repeatedly from people who are in detention, who may have lived in the United States for decades, have family there, have never committed any crime, may even have a pathway to legal status in the United States. But especially for people who may be medically vulnerable, elderly, people who need to make money to be able to support their families. They are not able to, many people are not able to be released from detention at this point, given some of the restrictions that the Trump administration has now put on people who are in immigration detention facilities and restrictions on bail and bond, that many people simply give up their cases because they're so desperate and they're so afraid of what's going to happen if they stay longer. And the list goes on. We're seeing beatings in detention. We're seeing threats of abuse by guards at these detention facilities. It is perhaps the most desperate place that many people have ever been in their lives. Certainly, the immigration detention system is largely based on private prison companies, and private prison companies have uniquely benefited and profited from the immigration detention system. So something like 8 out of 10 people who are in an immigration detention facility are held in a facility that is owned or operated by a private prison company. And this has meant billions of dollars every year for private prison companies like CoreCivic, GEO, LaSalle Corrections, MTC, the list goes on, and it's growing. The amount of money that these private prison corporations are making has just skyrocketed. And you will hear on the shareholder calls of these private prison companies that they are positively gleeful about this particular opportunity. It's both. It's everything. It is a way to try to get people to leave the United States, even when they have valid claims to stay in the United States. And it's a way for private prison companies and everyone else involved to make a very pretty penny off of the backs of immigrant detainees and their families.
How long have you been in this arena of prisons and detention facilities? How long have you been working in this area?
I've worked on immigration issues for over 25 years and worked actively on immigration detention issues for the last decade.
And is it worse than it's ever been? Are you seeing it that way?
It is absolutely worse than I've ever seen it. This is a historical low point. The treatment of people in immigrant communities nationwide, the treatment of people in immigration detention facilities is something that I have not seen before.
Was this case that you were dealing with pregnant women in detention, which even saying that sentence sounds hypersensitive. We should be hypersensitive to a woman who is pregnant or postpartum. There are also regulations where ICE or immigration officials are not even supposed to be detaining these individuals. Can you give me there, and then we'll go into the case itself? Just give me some of the regulations that protect women in detention.
ICE is not supposed to be detaining people who are pregnant, postpartum, or nursing. That is part of an internal guidance that has governed the agency for several years. And there are also federal regulations that state that if somebody is shown to be pregnant in detention, that they should be released on parole from detention. And so the federal guidelines as well as federal regulations really have this idea that people who are pregnant should not be held in immigration detention facilities in the first place. Of course, what we are seeing under the Trump administration is the exact opposite. What we are seeing is likely much higher, perhaps even record levels, numbers of people who are pregnant in immigration detention facilities. And we first began to investigate this because we began to hear of an unusual number of women being held in immigration detention facilities in Louisiana. It seemed like there were dozens of people who were being held in a detention facility in Louisiana who were pregnant. And that really raised a lot of alarms for us because in previous administrations, we had seen perhaps maybe 12 people, ICE reported to Congress that there were maybe 12 people in a month that were detained who were pregnant nationwide. But to hear that this number of people in one facility itself really raised some alarm bells because it seemed that to be very clear that the government is not following their guidance and these regulations.
If I'm pregnant and in violation of my immigration status, where should I be put? Should I be monitored and stay at home until I give birth, or maybe put in a hospital setting? What would be the protocol? What would be the right procedure here?
Well, the protocol is to let people stay at home safely with their communities while their immigration case is being adjudicated. And certainly, I think it really peels back immigration detention is not something that is actually required in the first place. And for many of these women, in prior administrations, they would have been sitting at home while their case was winding through the immigration court system.
But it seems like the administration has painted immigrant with a broad brush of everybody's criminal. We're going to detain everybody, whether you're pregnant or not, or whether you deserve to be detained or not. And nobody gets to stay at home and plead their case. So everybody gets incarcerated, seems to be the way it's going.
That's right. And I think what we're seeing, especially for people who are medically vulnerable, people who are pregnant, people who have cancer, people who are elderly, people who are disabled, people who are quadriplegic. These are people who in prior administrations would never have been placed in immigration detention. The government would have, according to their regulations, released people who are medically vulnerable from custody because of the understanding that as a humanitarian practice, it makes no sense, and that it places people in even greater danger to be placed in a carceral setting like a detention facility.
So your organization and the ACLU noticed or became aware of this facility in Louisiana and the conditions therein and the way that these women were being treated. And you wrote a letter to the federal government, to different branches of the federal government, alerting them to the issues of concern. And I just want to read a section of it because I think it's terribly graphic and says quite a bit. This is a letter that you co-authored. These women reported gravely troubling experiences of shackling, use of restraints and solitary confinement, delayed and substandard prenatal care, denial of prenatal vitamins, inadequate food and water, medical care provided without informed consent, lack of interpretation and translation in medical encounters, and medical neglect leading to dangerous infection after miscarriage. I mean, that's a list. We could take one of those and it would be a massive violation of these individuals' rights and their safety. But you listed all of them. And I'm assuming that that's what you noticed with the majority of the women that were in these facilities.
That's right. I mean, when we spoke to these women, they shared horrifying stories about their treatment in immigration detention. And these are women who are pregnant or people who lost their pregnancies while they were in detention. And they described the treatment that they had suffered. And it was, I have been doing this work for many years, and I speak to many people in detention. But the desperation and the trauma that these women in particular had faced in a time that should be a very, very happy and joyous time, it was completely the opposite. You can imagine that these women have been snatched from their families, and held in a detention center, oftentimes thousands of miles away from their homes. They're not only stricken with fear that they're going to be deported, they often have many other young children at home, but that they may also lose their pregnancies while in detention. And that is certainly the terror that they feel while they were held there. I mean, I can tell you that even just writing these stories up in the letter was particularly chilling because, as somebody who has had a child and has been pregnant, just to think about how, the treatment that these women were facing, it's just horrifying and heartbreaking.
I'm assuming that the facility that you were referencing in Louisiana is not a prenatal unit. It's not a prenatal detention facility.
I don't think that exists. It is a women's unit of a detention facility.
If I'm 6 months pregnant, I'm not getting the proper care is what I'm basically saying.
Well, many of the women that we talked to talked about the difficulty in getting very basic prenatal care. They talked about, people talked about not being able to get prenatal vitamins, which is a very basic part of prenatal care where the nurses just said, you're not going to die if you don't get this. They would raise concerns about really serious symptoms. They would talk about bleeding and cramps, but not get timely attention to those very serious symptoms. And I think the psychological impact that, this had was incredibly traumatic. We talked to women who were pregnant and being placed in solitary confinement for 3 days, which is something that all policies say should not happen. We talked to women who spoke about the fact that they were being shackled and chained while they were actively miscarrying. They were bleeding on the way to the hospital and being placed in shackles. This type of treatment, especially during an inherently traumatic period, I think has scarred women for life in many cases. We talked to one woman who had suffered from an incredibly difficult pregnancy and birth, and now has been suffering from a post-traumatic, depression. She has been suffering from eclampsia, which is a very severe pregnancy conditions, and have no doubt that this was related to the trauma and treatment that she encountered while she was in detention.
This sounds barbaric. I mean, it sounds inhumane. I don't even understand how the federal government would even allow those conditions. Maybe one mistakenly, but a dozen or more? Is this something that's still happening?
It is something that is absolutely still happening. And I actually want to tell the story of one woman in particular.
Please.
So, Lucia, this is a pseudonym. She was detained after she went in for a regular check-in appointment with ICE. And she began to have heavy vaginal bleeding in the middle of the night when she was 2 months pregnant. She asked for immediate medical attention, but she was not taken to see anyone for several hours. Instead, they took her to a small room and left her bleeding alone without giving her any food or water or pain medication. And after she lost so much blood, they took her to the emergency room and they shackled her arms and legs as she was actively miscarrying. When she got to the hospital, she had lost so much blood that she required a blood transfusion because she suffered a miscarriage. And if you can imagine, this is only because this is somebody who had been checking in with ICE for years and who ICE knew was living safely in the community. And they chose to take her in at this particular time and knew her condition. But yet she was subject to this incredibly barbaric treatment.
Just to ask a question right there before you move next. She, as one would say, was doing everything legally, right? I mean, she was fulfilling her requirements and keeping her appointments because she was in some way trying to regularize or normalize her immigration status. So she was doing everything that she should. What is with the shackles?
That's a very good question.
She's not doing anything criminally. She's showing up for her appointments. She gets detained because of probably the time that we're in. They're detaining everybody. But I don't understand what shackles are for. That would mean that she's a flight risk or she's criminally charged. I don't understand.
You're asking a very good question. And I think this is what is so disturbing about the way that ICE is going about its business, right? They're treating everybody as a potential security threat. They're criminalizing the system. And so we are seeing people who are visibly pregnant, not likely to run very far anywhere, being placed in chains and shackles, right? Even though we know that can have very serious harm during pregnancy.
Well, and you were going to tell another story?
So, I mean, another story of a woman that we talked to, Marie, she was a graduate student. She was a lawful visitor to the United States. She was held at this detention facility for more than 20 weeks during a very high risk pregnancy. When she was placed into detention, she told ICE officers that she was pregnant, but they placed her in solitary confinement because even though that is clearly in violation of protocol. And when she was in detention, she asked for help. She knew she was pregnant. She knew she wasn't getting the care that she needed, but she never received medical treatment until several other immigrant women who were detained alongside her advocated for her and begged that she receive medical care. She talked about the fact that she couldn't get prenatal vitamins. And that's the story where the nurse said, "You're not going to die if you don't take them." And she was only released after legal advocates intervened for several weeks. After her detention, she developed eclampsia, which is an incredibly dangerous pregnancy complication. And she continues to struggle with postpartum depression that is linked to her detention trauma. I mean, these are stories of women who were trying to do everything right, who told ICE, "I'm pregnant," and knew that they should not be detained in the first place. And yet ICE turned a blind eye and continued to detain these very vulnerable people in these abject conditions.
There was also something in the list that I read, maybe a separate story where, let me see if I can find it real quickly. Care provided without informed consent. I read a story in the article that you had written, the ACLU had written, where a woman went in not even knowing that she was pregnant and was probed and examined, given some kind of chemical treatment, and then later miscarried. So Do I have that story right?
Well, yes. There are, we've heard from women who went into medical care settings where, and there is an ethical duty and a legal requirement that when somebody does not speak English, that they are provided with translation and interpretation so that they know the basic things that are happening to them in a medical appointment or procedure, especially important when one is as invasive as a vaginal examination or perhaps even an injection. This is clearly a basic right, a constitutional right, a human right. And, I think these stories bring back very, very dark memories and dark histories of the way that people who are being held in government custody may be treated. It brings back, a case that we heard about under the first Trump administration where women who were in immigration detention facilities were subject to non-consensual gynecological procedures by a doctor that was getting an inordinate number of women referred to him in that community. It is incredibly important to understand how vulnerable people are when they're in detention, and particularly so when you look at it with the lens of vulnerability of language, of gender, of lack of citizenship, and especially if you're pregnant. There's so much happening at that particular time.
I'm telling you, Eunice, I do this for a living, and I listen and hear and report for a living, and I've heard stories similar to these for a long time. This is really bothering me. This is really getting under my skin. And I'm only assuming, given what we're seeing going on in Minneapolis and given what plans the administration has to build more facilities, it's just going to be more of the same, or this is going to multiply. I don't want to sound so pessimistic or hopeless, but I'm seeing this going to get worse.
John, we're heading into a very dark time in our history. This is something that is going to be one of the most shameful chapters in American history. And I think what is very important right now is to be able to do everything we can to prevent and rewrite these stories. And part of it is by being in connection with people who are vulnerable and may possibly be subject to enforcement and detention. A lot of it is also making sure that our public officials stand up against the ability of the government to do this. We have to argue that the government can't be funding these detention facilities. We have to know that the dollars that have gone from providing people healthcare, from providing people education, from providing people food stamps, that money is going to fuel this immigration detention and enforcement machine. And that is a specific and very clear decision that Congress made in its funding for these particular agencies. What is really important is that we have to stand up. We have to tell our government officials this is enough. We have to claw back this money from ICE. ICE should not be able to provide, ICE should not be given billions and billions of dollars upon end to build this enforcement and detention machine. We should be building schools. We should be building hospitals instead of detention facilities in our communities.
I'm really bothered by this. I can't believe how I'm having a physical reaction to what I'm hearing, even though I've read it. But I see an administration who doesn't give a shit. They are flouting the law on purpose, and immigrant to them means less than human. These are my interpretations of what I see. So what? We throw a pregnant woman in a detention facility and don't give her proper care. She's an immigrant. Or we're trying to get her back. She shouldn't have come in the first place, is kind of the attitude that I'm getting. So I guess sort of like the last question or two is, I know that you listed things that you were doing, but it feels like it's not enough. And I don't mean to criticize the work of the ACLU, but it just feels like this is a steamroller that we can't stop.
Well, I have to maintain hope that we can stop it. And we have seen successful vindication of people whose human rights and civil rights are, being violated. We have seen justice happen, but it doesn't happen without a fight. And I think one thing that is so important is for everybody in whatever capacity we all have to be standing up, because that is when the tide turns. I have been so heartened, not only by, it is the small and the large actions that add up. And, I'm heartened by the things that I have seen in my community and communities across the country where people are standing up, even if they don't have the most power in the world. It includes, the mom making sure that the kids next door who have immigrant parents can get to school by walking them to school on time, by, the churches who are providing food to people who are afraid to leave their houses because of immigration raids. It is the doctors who are seeing patients and saying, ICE, you can't talk to them while I'm giving them treatment. It is the legal observers like Renee Good who are taking videotape and really exposing the truth of what is happening on the streets. It is the teachers who are advocating for their students who have been taken into detention, writing letters and saying, we need this kid released from detention. He needs to come home, back to class. The legal workers, the lawyers who battle to stop people from getting deported every day in immigration courts, the legislators who are trying to stop this. It takes so many people to be able to stop this. And every whistle that is blown in the street and every phone call that is made to a member of Congress, these are all things that are going to add up. And, that is only the start, but I'm so heartened by seeing people viewing what is happening and understanding what's happening to our immigrant communities, our families, our neighbors, our friends, our coworkers, being caught up in this dragnet and saying, I'm not going to stand for this. This is not something that I am going to allow to happen.
I love every word that you just said. My job, my role in this is to raise awareness, to take stories such as yours and the efforts that you're making and to try and reach as large of an audience as possible so that maybe someone within that audience does exactly what you're suggesting, takes action, helps out. Are there women who have come forward to tell their personal narratives? I know so many immigrants right now are running scared. They don't want their faces out there. They don't want to incur the wrath of the administration. Are there people coming forward to tell their stories that you are aware of?
The 12 women that we talked to were so incredibly grateful that these stories are getting out there. I talked to one of the women actually over Christmas. She sent me a text and, we were talking about her baby was actually born outside of detention because there was intervention to get her released from custody. But she said, I'm the lucky one and we need so many more people standing up for women like me and people who are in detention so that no one has to go through this again. And I think, her immigration case is proceeding and many of the other women's immigration cases are proceeding and they are very frightened of coming forward and disclosing their identity because of the clear retaliation that has happened to so many people by this particular administration. But I think what her words really meant to me is that all of us, everyone who's listening to this podcast, anyone who's read the letter, we really need to hear those words and understand those experiences. And when we see what's happening in our community, to speak out against it because we know what is going to happen if we don't.
We shouldn't be standing for this. We shouldn't settle for allowing this to happen, regardless of your immigration status.
Well, thank you so much, John. And thank you for your work in spreading these messages to the broader world.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you for listening to The Raid, available wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about our guests and the subjects we cover, please visit our website at theraidpodcast.org.